If you think humans are the strongest species in the galaxy, you're already wrong. The truth is far worse. Humans aren't the strongest. We're the only ones who can make monsters choose not to kill us. Across thousands of star systems, entire civilizations vanished without a single shot fired. No debris, no signals, just clean, impossible silence. And at the center of it all, there was always one constant: a human, and something ancient standing beside them, not as a weapon, not as a slave, but as something far more dangerous, something that cared. This isn't a story about war. It's a story about what happens when the most lethal predators in existence learn how to love and decide who deserves to live. If that idea unsettles you, good, because it should.
Hit subscribe now, because what you're about to hear will change the way you see humanity. And by the end of this story, you might start wondering whether we saved the galaxy or quietly took control of it.
Log begins at 3:17:22 Standard Coalition Time as the survey vessel Kepri 9 slips into low orbit around an unregistered planet at the edge of a decaying star cluster, a sphere of ash-gray silence with no oceans, no cloud bands, no visible biosignatures, yet threaded with a faint electromagnetic pulse repeating every 11.2 seconds like a slow, mechanical heartbeat. Inside the command deck, Commander Velk stands motionless, tall and narrow-framed, his segmented eyes reflecting layered telemetry feeds, posture rigid not from fear, but from discipline. Because fear implies uncertainty, and Velk does not allow uncertainty to exist unmeasured. Confirm atmospheric instability, radiation within survivable margins, no active transmissions. Deploy drones. His voice flat, precise, almost bored, as 3 survey drones detach and descend in controlled spirals, their black hulls cutting through a haze of charged dust that clings to them like static memory, transmitting live visual feeds that flood the central display. Structures below that resemble cities only in layout, not in condition. Towers bent inward as if compressed by an invisible fist. Alloy frameworks stretched into filament-thin strands. Streets too clean, too empty. No debris patterns consistent with explosions. No thermal scarring. No impact craters. Just absence. Engineered absence. Like something had removed everything that once resisted it. Sensor engineer Ral leans forward, mandibles tightening in a small, involuntary tink. Commander, density readings are inconsistent. Mass distribution suggests material displacement without fragmentation. Velk does not turn. Define. Raal hesitates half a second too long. It's as if the matter was relocated, not destroyed. Silence lingers for exactly 1 beat before Velk responds. Matter does not relocate itself. While behind them, junior analyst Saren scrolls through archival threat signatures, her hands moving faster than protocol allows, because something about the pattern feels familiar and the way nightmares feel familiar, not from memory, but from instinct. No known weapon matches this profile, she says quietly, almost hoping no one hears it. But Velk does, and he files it away without comment as Drone 1 lowers into a collapsed plaza, its camera panning across a surface polished smooth by something that should not polish, picking up faint grooves etched in spirals that tighten toward a central void where even dust refuses to settle. Drone 2 enters what used to be an enclosed structure, its internal mapping flickering as if space itself resists being measured, walls bending in and out of alignment by fractions that accumulate into something impossible. While Drone 3 sweeps the perimeter and captures a brief distortion at the edge of its range, a ripple not in air, but in the concept of distance. like the frame itself hesitates. "Replay that," Velk orders, and the feed rewinds, slows, magnifies, revealing nothing concrete, only a suggestion of movement that does not correspond to any tracked object. "Interference?" Raoul offers, already knowing the answer. "Negative," Velk replies, "because interference follows rules, and this does not." As the electromagnetic pulse ticks again, 11. 2 seconds, precise. And with it, a subtle fluctuation in all three drone feeds, brightness dipping by a fraction, signal noise rising in a pattern that almost resembles breathing. Saren swallows. "Commander, the pulse is not random. It's synchronized with something." Velk finally shifts his stance, a minimal adjustment that signals full attention. Correlate with drone telemetry. Data overlays cascade, and for a moment, everything aligns. The pulse, the distortions, the absence, forming a pattern too large to see directly, like standing inside a machine without recognizing its shape, until Drone 1's proximity alert triggers, a soft chime that sounds absurdly polite given the context. "Object approaching," the system reports, but there is nothing on screen. Only the plaza, the spiral grooves, the empty center. "Visual confirmation?" Velk asks. "Negative," Raoul replies, fingers flying as he adjusts spectral filters. Thermal, gravimetric, exotic particle scans, all return noise. Yet the proximity alert climbs steadily, 20 meters, 15, 10. "It's there," Saren whispers, though she cannot point to it. And then the drone feed glitches. Not a full cut, just a single frame where the world seems folded. And in that fold, something occupies space without shape, a density that bends light and data alike. And then Drone 1 is gone. Not destroyed, not disconnected, simply removed from every channel as if it never existed. No explosion, no debris, no signal loss curve, just absence, clean and immediate. Raoul inhales sharply. "We lost it." "No, we didn't lose it. It's just not here." Velk's voice cuts through, still controlled. "Maintain observation. Do not extrapolate." But even he notes the deviation, because systems do not report nothing, they report failure. And this is neither. As Drone 2 inside the structure begins to transmit erratic spatial readings, corridors stretching beyond their mapped dimensions, corners refusing to resolve into consistent angles. "Mapping instability increasing," Raoul says, and then pauses. Because the instability is not random, it is directional, converging, moving toward the drone like a closing aperture. "Something is aligning," he corrects, just before Drone 2's feed compresses into a narrow tunnel of warp geometry and then collapses into static that does not fade, but simply ceases. 2 drones gone, no trace. The pulse ticks again. 11, 2 seconds. And this time, everyone on the deck feels it, not as sound, but as a pressure behind the eyes, a rhythm that does not belong to them. Saren grips the console edge. "Commander, we need to leave." Protocol broken, voice unsteady. Velk does not reprimand her, which is its own form of alarm. "Deploy final drone to high-altitude sweep," he orders, because data is survival, and retreat without understanding is failure. Drone 3 climbs, accelerating above the distortion field, its wide-angle sensors scanning the horizon where the dead cities stretch endlessly, repeating patterns of compression and absence, until it captures something at scale. Lines across the planet's surface, vast and faint, intersecting like a network, each node corresponding to a site of total erasure, all pulsing in sync with the 11. 2-second signal. planetary lattice, Felk murmurs, more to himself than the crew. Not natural, Rahl adds unnecessarily, as the drone zooms toward one intersection and the distortion appears again, larger now. Not a point, but a region where the ground seems to dip into a depth that cannot be measured, and within that depth, the sensors register a spike, mass, energy, something that exists by every metric, and yet refuses representation. We are not observing a predator, Felk says slowly, recalibrating. We are observing a system. But even as he says it, the classification feels insufficient, because systems do not hunt. And yet Drone 3's proximity alert activates despite its altitude, distance decreasing in a way that defies geometry, 500 meters, 300, 100. Impossible, Rahl breathes. It's closing without movement. Saren's display fills with cascading errors, coordinates rewriting themselves. It's not moving through space, it's redefining where space is, she says, the words tumbling out before she can filter them, and Velk recognizes the pattern now. Not from database, but from logic. Something that does not traverse distance, but eliminates it. Recall the drone, he orders. But the command never executes, because the feed flickers again, and for a fraction of a second, the thing is visible, not as a form, but as a contradiction. Edges that both exist and do not, a silhouette made of missing information. And then Drone 3 vanishes with the same clean finality as the others. Silence floods the deck, broken only by the steady pulse. 11, 2 seconds. Now unmistakably external and intentional. Velk stands perfectly still, processing, recalculating every assumption, every model, and discarding them one by one until only one conclusion remains. One he does not speak immediately, because to define it is to acknowledge it, and acknowledgement carries weight, but protocol demands action. "Prepare emergency transmission," he says at last, and Saren's hands move automatically, locking onto the nearest relay buoy, compressing data into a burst packet. "Include all telemetry, mark as existential threat," Velk continues, voice unchanged but eyes sharper now, focused not on the planet, but on the absence between data points. "Designation pending," Rahl prompts, and Velk answers after a precise pause. "Unknown predatory entity, non-localized, non-linear, do not engage." The transmission buffer fills, ready to send, when the pulse hits again, and this time the ship itself responds, systems flickering in microsecond intervals, not failing but hesitating, like a heartbeat skipping. "Commander, something's interacting with the hull field," Rahl reports, alarm rising despite his training. "Distance?" Velk asks, though he already knows the answer will be meaningless. "0, Saren whispers before the system can, because the sensors are already rewriting their own readings, and in that instant, Velk understands the final rule that governs this thing. Distance is irrelevant, visibility is optional, and survival is conditional. "Transmit," he orders, and the message launches, a tight beam of data punching through space before anything can redefine it, carrying a single appended line that Velk adds manually, breaking his own adherence to pure data for the first time in his career. "Do not let it leave this planet." The outpost did not have a name that anyone used out loud, only a designation, Biological Research Node E17, anchored to the shadow side of a mineral-rich moon orbiting a quiet orange dwarf, far enough from major routes that nothing arrived by accident, which was exactly why Dr.
Lin Tran had requested the transfer. Isolation meant control, and control meant variables could be measured without interference. At least that had been the plan before the coalition-wide alert threaded through every secure channel. Velk's transmission, compressed into a cold directive, that repeated on loop in the lab's background systems. Unknown predatory entity, non-localized,
Non-linear, do not engage. A warning so absolute it bordered on useless, because do not engage assumes you can choose not to. And Lynn had already learned that most biological systems do not respect instructions. They respond to conditions. She stood at the central workbench, sleeves rolled, a thin line of dried blood across her left wrist from a minor cut she had not noticed until it had already clotted. Eyes fixed on the containment tray in front of her, where the impossible lay curled into itself, like a question that refused to be asked properly. The specimen had arrived 12 hours earlier in a sealed retrieval pod, flagged as debris from an unregistered survey vessel. Its outer shell scorched but intact, its internal stasis field degraded just enough to fail at the exact moment the pod was opened, which was when it moved for the first time. "Tell me again why we didn't vent it into space," Cade said from the doorway, arms crossed, posture loose in the way of someone trained for violence rather than analysis, his gaze never leaving the thing on the table, because even at rest it resisted being ignored. "Because it was alive," Lynn replied without looking up, adjusting the scanner array so its beams swept across the specimen in overlapping layers, mapping density, temperature, electrical activity, all of which returned inconsistent data that refused to settle into stable readings. "Alive doesn't mean safe," Cade shot back, stepping closer despite himself, drawn by the same gravitational curiosity that had pulled Lynn in the moment the pod opened, and the creature, if that word applied, had uncoiled just enough to reveal that it did not have a fixed geometry, its surface shifting in slow, almost thoughtful gradients, edges forming and dissolving without pattern, like a shadow trying to remember what it was supposed to belong to. "Nothing is safe," Lynn said, finally glancing at him, her expression not dismissive, but focused. "But this is new." And that was the axis everything turned on for her. Not danger, but novelty. Because novelty meant discovery, and discovery meant understanding, and understanding was the only thing that had ever reliably reduced fear. The scanner chimed softly, flagging a microfluctuation in the specimen's outer layer, a ripple that coincided not with any external stimulus, but with Lynn's own movement as she shifted her weight. A detail so small it would have been easy to ignore if she had not been looking for patterns where none should exist. "Did you see that?" she murmured, more to herself than to Cade, who frowned. "See what?" "It responded," Lynn said, lowering her hand slowly toward the edge of the containment field, not crossing it, just hovering close enough that the sensors registered the proximity and the specimen's surface tightened. Subtly, almost imperceptibly, but enough to register as a change. "It's reactive," Cade said, already reaching for the sidearm clipped to his belt. "Everything reacts," Lynn countered. "The question is how." She withdrew her hand and the surface relaxed, the shift reversing in a way that suggested not random motion, but a form of feedback, input and output linked by something that might, if given enough time, resemble behavior. Protocol dictated immediate containment escalation and remote observation, but protocol had not been written for this. Not for something that did not conform to any known biological model, and Lynn had built her career on the edges of those gaps, where rules thinned out and judgment filled the space. "I'm going to feed it," she said, already turning toward the nutrient synthesizer, selecting a high-density protein matrix and adjusting its composition on instinct rather than data, because there was no data to rely on, only hypotheses that would either survive contact or collapse under it. "You're not serious," Cade said, incredulity sharpening his voice. "We don't even know if it eats." "We don't know that it doesn't," Lynn replied, placing a small portion of the synthesized material into a secondary tray and sliding it through the containment interface where it hovered a few centimeters from the specimen. inert, unremarkable, waiting. Nothing happened for 2 seconds. A span long enough for Cade to exhale in a short, humorless breath. See, and then the material was gone. Not consumed in any visible way, not dissolved or broken down, simply absent. The tray registering a mass deficit that could not be reconciled with any known transfer process. Okay, Cade said slowly, hand tightening on his weapon. I don't like that. Lynn did not respond immediately. Her attention locked on the scanner readouts as they spiked and dipped in chaotic patterns that gradually smoothed into something almost rhythmic, as if the act of feeding had stabilized a process that had been searching for equilibrium. It's metabolizing, she said, though the word felt inadequate. Or integrating, Cade offered darkly. Into what? Lynn asked, and for once he did not have an answer. She reached for the console and initiated an audio output, a low, steady tone that filled the containment chamber at a controlled amplitude, not because she believed the specimen could hear in any conventional sense, but because sound was structured vibration, and structured vibration was information. And information was the closest thing to a universal language any scientist could hope for. What are you doing now? Cade asked, exasperation creeping in. Talking, Lynn said simply, and then after a beat, she added her own voice to the tone, speaking softly, not in any formal protocol language, but in the one she had grown up with, the cadence familiar, the rhythm natural, words that carried more than meaning. They carried intent, emotion, subtle shifts that no translation algorithm could fully capture. It's okay, she said, aware of how absurd it sounded and choosing not to care. You're safe here. The specimen's surface stilled, not completely, but enough that the baseline fluctuations dampened, the scanner lines flattening into something closer to coherence. And Cade noticed it despite himself. That's new, he admitted, lowering his hand a fraction from his weapon, not holstering it. Not yet, but reconsidering the immediate necessity. Minutes passed in careful increments, Lynn alternating between offering small amounts of nutrient and maintaining a steady stream of low-level auditory input, her voice threading through the sterile air of the lab. While the specimen's responses grew more consistent, not more predictable, never that, but less chaotic, as if it were mapping the boundaries of this new environment and choosing not to breach them. Why isn't it attacking? Cade said finally, the question that had been sitting between them from the moment the pod opened. Maybe it doesn't need to, Lynn replied. Or maybe it's deciding. She glanced at him then, meeting his eyes with a seriousness that cut through the clinical detachment she usually wore. Predators don't always strike immediately. Sometimes they observe. That's not reassuring, Cade muttered, but he did not step back, and that, in its own way, was a shift. The lab lights dimmed slightly as the station cycled through its energy-saving protocols, casting softer shadows across the containment field. And in that altered light, the specimen's form seemed to gather itself, not into a fixed shape, but into a more defined presence, its edges less diffuse, its center, if it had one, denser, oriented toward Lynn in a way that suggested focus, not in the human sense, but in a directional bias that could be measured if one chose to define it that way. It's tracking you, Cade said quietly, and Lynn nodded because she felt it too, not as a threat, but as a tension, a vector pointed in her direction that did not waver when she moved. Good, she said under her breath. That means it recognizes a pattern. She reached out again, slower this time, fingers stopping just short of the containment boundary, and held there, steady, offering not contact but proximity. And the specimen responded by extending a thin, filament-like projection toward the same point, not crossing the barrier, not triggering any alarms, just mirroring the distance with eerie precision, a symmetry that sent a brief, involuntary chill down Cade's spine. "Lynn," he said, voice low, warning threaded through it. "If that field fails, it won't," she interrupted, not out of arrogance but calculation, because she had already reinforced the containment parameters twice over, compensating for variables she could not name by over-engineering the ones she could control. And still, she was aware of the margin for error, aware that if the thing decided to ignore the field, there might be no physical mechanism capable of stopping it. But that was not the data she was getting, not from this interaction, not now. The filament hovered, then withdrew, the specimen's surface shifting again in that almost thoughtful way, and Lynn felt a flicker of something she refused to label as emotion because emotion would compromise observation. But the thought formed anyway. It chose not to touch. "You see that?" she said softly. "It's respecting the boundary." Cade let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, or it's learning the limits before it breaks them. "Maybe," Lynn conceded. "But learning goes both ways." She straightened, pulling her hand back, and the specimen's orientation adjusted a fraction, maintaining that invisible line between them. "I'm going to run a longer cycle," she said, turning back to the console. "Sustained interaction, controlled inputs, gradual variation. You're going to keep it," Kay translated bluntly. And Lynn paused just long enough for the truth of that to settle. Because there were a dozen reasons not to. Protocols, directives, the very real possibility that this was the same class of entity described in Velk's transmission, the thing that erased drones and bent space and reduced entire worlds to clean, empty scars. And yet, this was not that. Or if it was something more, something at a different scale. A fragment, perhaps, a juvenile, a state before whatever it became out there in the dark between planets. "Yes," she said finally, voice quiet but unambiguous. "I am." Cade studied her for a long moment, weighing risk against trust, training against instinct. And then he shook his head once, a short, resigned motion. "Then I'm not leaving this room," he said, moving to a position where he could see both Lynn and the containment field, his hand resting near his weapon not as a threat, but as a contingency. "Good," Lynn replied, a faint hint of relief threading through her focus. "I'd rather not do this alone." She looked back at the specimen, at the way it had settled into a more stable configuration, its fluctuations now echoing the rhythm of the station's ambient systems. Or perhaps her own movements, she could not yet tell. And she allowed herself one small, unrecorded deviation from strict procedure. One word spoken not for data, but for intention. "Milo," she said, testing the sound of it in the air, assigning identity where none had existed before. And the specimen's surface rippled in response. Not dramatically, not in a way that would convince a skeptic, but enough that Lynn marked the timestamp and the change with a precision that bordered on reverence. Because in that subtle shift lay the first break in a rule the galaxy had accepted as absolute, that some things could not be reached, could not be understood, could not be anything but what they were. And yet here, in a quiet lab at the edge of nowhere, something that should have erased her instead stayed. The first anomaly that Lynn could not dismiss as coincidence occurred at 2:11 station time, logged automatically as a deviation in environmental stability inside Containment Chamber B, though the system flagged it as minor and non-critical. A fractional drop in ambient vibration that should not have mattered if not for the fact that it aligned exactly with the moment Lynn's voice stopped. She had been speaking continuously for nearly 40 minutes, not because protocol required it, but because the pattern had shown measurable effects. Milo's surface fluctuations dampened when exposed to consistent auditory input, particularly human speech, and more specifically, her voice. A variable she had not yet isolated but could not ignore. So when she paused to take a breath, to flex the stiffness out of her fingers, the chamber changed. Not visibly, not dramatically, but enough that the sensor grid recalibrated, searching for a missing constant. "You see that?" she said, already leaning forward, eyes scanning the waveform displays as Milo's outer layer tightened by a margin so small it would have been lost in noise without continuous comparison data. "It's reacting to silence now." Cade shifted his weight behind her, arms still crossed but less rigid than they had been 12 hours earlier, his stance no longer purely defensive, but observational. A subtle but important shift. "Or it's reacting to the absence of you," he said, not entirely joking. And Lynn did not dismiss it. "Because the distinction mattered," she resumed, speaking immediately, voice steady, tone low, and the fluctuation reversed, smoothing out as if the system had been corrected. "That's not just stimulus response," she murmured, recording the timestamp, tagging the event. "That's expectation." She glanced back at Milo, at the way its form had begun to favor a loose central mass with trailing extensions that retracted and extended in slow, deliberate motions, less like random biological drift and more like a system optimizing for interaction within a constrained space. Over the next several hours, the pattern repeated in variations, Lynn introducing controlled changes, altering pitch, cadence, language, even switching to synthesized tones devoid of emotional inflection, and each time Milo responded differently. Not with immediate mimicry, but with adjustments that suggested discrimination, preference, a weighting of inputs that could not be explained by simple biochemical triggers. "It ignores the synth tones after 12 seconds, she noted, scrolling through the data, but maintains response to human vocalization indefinitely. "Maybe it's bored," Cade offered dryly, and Lynn almost smiled before catching herself, because humor implied comfort, and comfort implied lowered vigilance, something she could not afford even as the situation drifted further from any known threat model. Feeding cycles became more structured as well, no longer random offerings, but timed intervals with measured quantities. And Milo adapted with unsettling efficiency, its consumption stabilizing into a pattern that anticipated delivery by fractions of a second, the nutrient mass disappearing just before it fully entered the field, as if the boundary itself had become irrelevant to it in ways that did not trigger containment alarms. "That shouldn't be possible," Cade said the first time he noticed, leaning in closer than he had before, curiosity overtaking caution. "The field is intact," Lynn confirmed, running diagnostics that returned perfect integrity. "So either it's interacting at a level we're not measuring or—" She did not finish the sentence, because the alternative required redefining what inside and outside meant. And she was not ready to commit to that without more data. The first aggressive incident occurred without warning, which in retrospect was itself a warning, because Milo had established a pattern of gradual change, incremental adaptation. And this was abrupt, a break in rhythm that should have been predicted if they had been looking for discontinuities rather than continuities. A maintenance drone entered the lab on a routine cycle, its path pre-programmed, its presence irrelevant to the experiment. A small hovering unit tasked with surface sterilization, emitting a low-frequency hum that had been part of the background noise for hours. And for reasons Lynn could not immediately identify, that hum intersected with Milo's current state in a way that triggered a reaction, the specimen's surface snapping inward and then outward in a rapid contraction-expansion cycle that spiked every sensor in the chamber. "What is that?" Cade started, already reaching for his weapon. but the action was faster than either of them could process. A filament extending from Milo with a velocity that blurred into non-measurement, crossing the containment field without resistance, without triggering any alarms, intersecting the drone's chassis and then retracting in the same instant. And the drone simply ceased. Not falling, not sparking, just stopping mid-air, as if its operational state had been set to 0. "Kill it," Cade said immediately. Weapon up, safety off, the word reflexive, trained, and Lynn reacted just as fast, but in the opposite direction. "No!" Her voice sharp, cutting through the tension. "Wait!" Because the data was still coming in, the drone systems reporting no damage, no energy discharge, no loss of mass, only a complete halt in all processes, as if something had removed the concept of function from it. Milo's form shifted again, agitation evident now, fluctuations spiking, orientation no longer fixed on Lynn but oscillating between her and the inert drone. "It didn't destroy it," Lynn said quickly, thinking out loud. "It interrupted it." "That's worse," Cade snapped, finger tightening on the trigger. "Lynn, that thing just reached through a containment field like it wasn't there." "I know," she said, forcing her voice to stay level, because escalation here could cascade into outcomes she could not predict. "But look at it," she gestured toward Milo. "This isn't predatory behavior, it's reactive." She moved closer to the field, ignoring Cade's sharp intake of breath, and spoke again, softer now, slower. "Milo," she said, reintroducing the pattern they had established, anchoring the moment in something familiar. "It's okay." The effect was not immediate, but it was measurable. The spikes in Milo's readings began to dampen, the oscillations slowing, its orientation settling back toward her. The filament that had extended retracting fully, leaving no trace on the field. No residual distortion. Nothing that could be analyzed beyond the recorded data. "It didn't like the drone," Cade said, still tense but not firing, because the immediate threat had passed, or at least shifted. "Why?" Lynn asked, more to the data than to him, replaying the last seconds before the incident, isolating variables, and there it was, subtle but consistent. The drone's hum had overlapped with the frequency range of Lynn's voice, not identical, but close enough to create interference. "It thought it was me," she said slowly, the realization settling into place with a weight she did not expect. "Or something like me. And it neutralized it," Cade finished, the implication hanging between them, heavy, unavoidable. Lynn nodded once, then moved to the console and powered down all non-essential systems in the lab, eliminating background noise, reducing variables to the minimum. "From now on, no automated units in this room," she said, more to herself than to Cade, who did not argue, because he had seen enough to know that the rules were being written in real time, not followed. The aftermath of the incident revealed more than the event itself. Milo's behavior over the next hours shifting into something that, if Lynn had been less careful, she might have labeled as protective. Its orientation fixed almost exclusively on her, its fluctuations increasing whenever she moved out of its direct line of sight, if sight was the correct term, increasing when she returned, a feedback loop that reinforced proximity. "It's prioritizing you," Cade observed, quieter now, the edge in his voice replaced by something more analytical. "Yes," Lynn agreed, though the word felt insufficient, because prioritization implied a hierarchy of targets, and this felt more like a singular focus, everything else reduced to secondary or irrelevant states. "And it doesn't like competition," Cade added, glancing at the inert drone still hovering where it had been frozen, a silent reminder of how quickly the situation could shift. "No," Lynn said, watching Milo as it settled into a more stable configuration again. "It doesn't." She hesitated, then made a decision that she knew would be flagged if reported in full.
Help me move that.
She nodded toward the drone, and Cade frowned. You want it out of here? I want to see how it reacts, Lynn corrected, because every action now was data, every risk a calculated variable. Cade hesitated only a moment before stepping forward, moving slowly, deliberately, his path taking him between Lynn and the containment field for a brief second. And in that second, Milo's readings spiked again, not as violently as before, but enough to register. A clear, direct response to Cade's position relative to Lynn. Easy, Cade muttered under his breath, more to himself than to the thing watching him. And Lynn saw it then, not in the data, but in the pattern of it. The way Milo's attention tracked not just her, but the relationships between entities in the room, proximity, movement, potential interference, variables mapped in real time and weighted according to a logic that was not yet fully visible, but undeniably present. Cade reached the drone, disengaged its manual override, and carefully guided it toward the exit hatch, every movement slow, controlled. And as he increased the distance between himself and Lynn, Milo's readings dropped correspondingly, the tension easing as if a threshold had been crossed. That's very specific, Cade said once the drone was out and the hatch sealed, returning to his previous position, though now he chose one slightly further from Lynn than before, an adjustment made without conscious thought. It's not just reacting, Lynn said, her voice quieter now, the weight of the implications settling in. It's evaluating. She looked back at Milo, at the way it had stabilized again, its fluctuations now closely mirroring the rhythm of her own movements, her breathing, her speech, a synchronization that felt less like coincidence with every passing minute. And it's making choices, she added, the words precise, deliberate. Because in science, language mattered. Definitions mattered. And this crossed a boundary she had not expected to reach so quickly. She stepped closer to the containment field once more, stopping at the same distance as before, reestablishing the baseline they had built. And Milo responded in kind, extending that thin filament again, not crossing, not touching, just aligning, matching her position with exacting precision. And Lynn felt that flicker again, stronger this time. The one she refused to name, because naming it would change how she observed, how she acted, how she justified the next decision. And there would be a next decision. There always was. Milo, she said softly, marking the moment, anchoring it in data and in something else she could not quite quantify. And the filament held steady, the distance between them constant, unbroken. A boundary respected not because it had to be, but because, for now, it chose to be. The first external response did not arrive as a fleet or a threat, but as a silence in the network, a thinning of routine traffic that Lynn only noticed because she had trained herself to pay attention to absences as much as presences. Supply pings that usually came every 6 hours stretched to 8, then 10, then stopped entirely. Automated status checks from coalition oversight nodes queued and never confirmed. That's not normal, Cade said, leaning over the secondary console, scrolling through the backlog with a frown that deepened with each failed handshake. They're either down or they're ignoring us. Lynn did not answer immediately. Her focus split between the data and the containment chamber where Milo had entered a new behavioral phase over the last 32 hours, its activity cycles aligning almost perfectly with her own. Periods of low fluctuation when she rested, heightened responsiveness when she moved or spoke, a synchronization that had moved beyond simple reaction into something that resembled attunement, a word she avoided in her logs but could not fully exclude from her thoughts. The lab lights dimmed slightly as the station shifted into reduced power mode, not by schedule but by directive. A command pushed through the system with higher authority clearance than anything E-17 should have been receiving. We just got a priority override, Cade said, pulling up the header, his expression tightening. Coalition Military Command. He tapped the display, and the message unfolded in stark, compressed text. All independent research nodes are to initiate immediate containment lockdown on any non-classified biological entities pending retrieval. Do not transmit further data. Await collection units. That's us, Cade said unnecessarily, eyes flicking toward the chamber. They want it. Lynn read the message twice, not for content, but for tone, for what was not being said, because directives like this usually came with justification, context, something to anchor them in known parameters. And this had none. Only urgency stripped down to its barest form. No mention of termination, she noted quietly. That's new. Or they don't trust us to do it, Cade countered, already moving toward the armory locker embedded in the wall, his motions efficient, practiced. Either way, we're not handing it over without knowing what we're dealing with, Lynn said, her voice calm but edged now with something firmer than before, because the variables had changed. The experiment was no longer contained within the lab. It had been observed, categorized, and now claimed. And that shifted the balance from research to control, a domain she trusted far less. Milo responded to the change before either of them consciously registered it, its fluctuations increasing, not in the erratic spikes of agitation, but in a steady amplification that tracked the rising tension in the room, its orientation locking onto Lynn with greater intensity, the thin filament extending and retracting in short, repeated motions that suggested a feedback loop seeking resolution. It knows, Cade said under his breath, watching the readings climb. It doesn't know, Lynn corrected automatically, though the distinction felt increasingly semantic. It's responding. She stepped closer to the field, lowering her voice, slowing her movements, reintroducing the patterns that had stabilized Milo before. It's okay, she said, not because she believed it in the broader context, but because the immediate context required it. And Milo's fluctuations dampened slightly in response, not fully stabilizing, but reducing enough to prevent escalation. Good, she murmured, logging the change even as her mind tracked the larger problem, because data collection had become as much a reflex as breathing. The second message arrived 7 minutes later, not through official channels, but as a fragmented burst that slipped through the station's outer comm array before the system could block it. Raw, unfiltered, flagged with an identifier Lynn did not recognize, but Cade did immediately. That's Velk's ship, he said, pulling the packet into a secure buffer, isolating it from the main system. I thought, so did I, Lynn replied, already decrypting the data, her fingers moving faster now, urgency overriding the careful pacing she had maintained until this point. The file opened into a compressed video feed, corrupted in places but still coherent enough to convey the essential. A command deck similar in structure to theirs, but far more advanced. Lights dimmed to emergency levels, crew stations abandoned or offline, and at the center, Commander Velk. Posture still rigid but no longer composed, microfractures visible in the plating along his upper limbs, signs of stress or damage. His voice, when it came, was not panicked, but strained in a way that suggested something had pushed him beyond his calibrated limits. If this transmission reaches any active node, he began, the words clipped, precise, but with an undercurrent of urgency that had not been present in his original directive. The entity is not singular. The feed flickered, cutting out for a fraction of a second before resuming. It does not traverse space. It eliminates the concept of distance between itself and its target. Lynn felt a cold, familiar recognition settle in, her mind mapping his words onto the behavior she had observed in Milo, the way it had interacted with the containment field, with the drone, with proximity itself. Scale is variable, Velk continued. We have observed fragments. The word carried weight, chosen deliberately. Smaller instances that exhibit partial behavioral patterns. Cade glanced at Lynn, the implication immediate. "That's what this is," he said, not a question. And Lynn did not answer, because Velk was still speaking. "Do not attempt containment through conventional means," he said. And for the first time there was something like emphasis in his tone. "It adapts through interaction, not resistance." The feed glitched again, a distortion passing across the screen that resembled the anomalies from his earlier transmission. If a fragment establishes a stable reference point, the audio cut, replaced by a burst of static, then resumed mid-sentence. It will prioritize that reference above all other variables. Lynn's gaze snapped to Milo, to the way its orientation had remained fixed on her, the way it had reacted to Cade's position, to the drone, to anything that interfered with that line. "Reference point," she repeated under her breath, the term slotting into place with a precision that made her chest tighten. "That's you," Cade said quietly. And this time she did not correct him, because the data supported it. Velk's image stabilized briefly, his eyes, those multifaceted lenses, seeming to focus directly into the recording, as if he could see beyond it, beyond time, beyond distance. "If you have established such a link," he said, "you are no longer observing the entity." A pause, a fraction longer than his usual cadence. "You are part of its operational framework." The words hung in the air of the lab long after the audio cut out completely, the feed collapsing into static and then nothing. The transmission terminated not by completion, but by absence. The same clean, absolute absence that had consumed his drones, his crew, perhaps his ship. Silence settled over the room, heavy, compressive, broken only by the soft hum of the station's life support and the faint, irregular fluctuations from the containment chamber. "Operational framework," Cade repeated, the phrase tasting wrong in his mouth. "That doesn't sound like a pet." Lynn exhaled slowly, forcing her thoughts into order, because panic would distort the data, and distorted data led to bad decisions. "It's not," she said, the admission quiet but clear. "It never was." She turned back to the console, pulling up every log they had recorded since Milo's arrival, overlaying them with Velk's transmission, searching for alignment, for confirmation, for any point where the patterns diverged in a way that might offer control. And instead, she found convergence. Behaviors that matched at different scales. Responses that echoed the larger entity's capabilities in limited, localized forms. "It's learning through me," she said finally, the conclusion forming not as a hypothesis, but as an inevitability. Not just reacting, learning. "And prioritizing you," Cade added, his voice tight again, tension returning with a different shape now, less immediate threat and more strategic concern. "Which means if anyone comes through that door..." He did not finish, because he did not need to. The image of the maintenance drone suspended mid-air was still too fresh, too clear. As if summoned by the thought, the station's proximity alarms activated, a low, steady tone that cut through the room with clinical precision. "Incoming vessel," the system announced. "Unidentified. No transponder. Trajectory locked to docking ring 3. Cade was already moving, grabbing his rifle from the locker, checking the charge with a quick, practiced glance. "That didn't take long," he said, positioning himself between the entrance and the lab, his stance shifting fully into combat readiness now, the observational phase over, replaced by the necessity of defense. "Lynn," he added, not taking his eyes off the door. "We need to decide right now. Do we hand it over or do we keep it?" Lynn looked at Milo, at the way its form had stabilized again despite the rising alarms, its orientation unwavering, the filament extending once more toward the boundary where she stood, aligning with her position as it had before, precise, deliberate, a constant in a system that was rapidly losing all others. And she understood then that there was no clean separation between those options anymore. No version of events where she could simply step back and let someone else take control. Because Velk had been right. She was no longer an observer. She was a variable, a reference, a node in whatever this thing was becoming. "We can't hand it over," she said. The words firm now, grounded in both data and the realization that had followed it. "It won't go." Cade's jaw tightened, but he nodded once, accepting the logic even if he did not like the implications. "Then we hold," he said, adjusting his grip on the rifle as the docking clamps engaged somewhere beyond the lab walls, the metallic echo carrying through the station like a countdown. And behind Lynn, inside the containment field, Milo's fluctuations rose again. Not erratic, not uncontrolled, but sharpened, focused, as if something in the system had just shifted from passive observation to active engagement. The docking clamps finished locking with a final resonant thud that carried through the station's structure like a physical impact, a vibration that traveled along the metal spine of E-17 and settled somewhere behind Lynn's ribs. Not painful, but impossible to ignore, as if the station itself recognized the intrusion before its systems finished processing it. "Seal all internal bulkheads," Cade ordered, overriding standard protocol with his security clearance, the doors along the corridor slamming shut in sequence, each one buying them a few more seconds they did not actually have, because time had already started to behave differently the moment the incoming vessel ignored identification requests. "No transponder, no handshake, no delay," he muttered, more to himself than to Lynn. "They're not here to talk." Lynn did not respond immediately, her attention split between the external threat and the internal one, because Milo had changed again, not in the chaotic way of earlier reactions, but in something far more controlled, its fluctuations tightening into narrow bands of activity that spiked in direct correlation with the station's alerts, each alarm tone producing a measurable shift, not agitation, but alignment, as if the noise was being cataloged, sorted, integrated into a growing model of the environment. "It's mapping the situation," she said quietly, fingers moving across the console as she layered incoming sensor data with Milo's internal readings, searching for causality. "We're preparing for it," Cade replied, already positioned near the reinforced lab entrance, rifle raised, safety disengaged, his breathing steady but shallower than before. Controlled adrenaline rather than panic. "Contact in 30 seconds, the station AI announced, voice neutral, detached, as if the words carried no weight, as if this were routine, and in some parts of the galaxy, maybe it was. But not here, not now, not with what they had inside that room. The first breach did not come at the main door, but through the walls, a distortion rather than an impact, the metal surface along the far side of the lab rippling inward as if it had briefly forgotten how to remain solid. Cade swung toward it instantly, rifle tracking the movement. "That's not a cutter," he said, voice tight, because he had seen cutting tools, explosives, plasma charges, and this was none of them. This was absence intruding into presence, a seam opening where there should have been none. And then it resolved into a doorway that had never been installed, edges too clean, too precise, revealing 3 figures stepping through without resistance, their armor matte black, featureless except for the faint shimmer of adaptive shielding, no insignia, no visible identifiers, only weapons held low but ready. "Coalition Retrieval Unit?" Lynn asked, though she already knew the answer, because official units did not arrive like this, did not bypass systems without authorization codes, did not ignore protocol so completely. "Negative," one of the figures replied, voice filtered through a modulator that stripped it of any personal inflection. Independent contract. Cade let out a short, humorless breath. Mercs, he translated. Of course they sent mercs. His rifle tightened into his shoulder. You're not authorized to be here, he added, because even if the words held no power, saying them was part of the process, part of maintaining control over a situation that was already slipping beyond it. Authorization is irrelevant, the lead figure said, stepping further into the room, helmet angled slightly as if scanning. We have a directive to secure the specimen. Lynn felt Milo's reading spike at that word, not violently but sharply, a clear, direct response to the shift in focus. Specimen is under active study, she said, keeping her voice level, measured. Removal at this stage risk is accounted for. The mercenary cut in, lifting their weapon just enough to signal escalation without fully committing to it. Stand aside. Cade did not move, his stance unchanged, the barrel of his rifle now aligned directly with the lead figure's center mass. That's not happening, he said, and for a fraction of a second, the room held in a perfect, fragile balance, tension stretched to its limit, every variable poised on the edge of action. Milo broke that balance, not with violence, but with attention, its entire form shifting in a single, unified motion toward the new arrivals, fluctuations compressing into a tight, high-frequency pattern that lit up every sensor in the chamber. What is that? One of the mercenaries said, voice no longer entirely neutral, a hint of something, uncertainty perhaps, bleeding through the modulation, because whatever briefing they had received had not prepared them for this, for a presence that did not behave like any known life form. That's what you came for, Lynn replied, and she could not keep a trace of something out of her voice now. Not quite defiance, not quite warning, but close to both. The lead mercenary took a step closer to the containment field, weapon lowering slightly as their attention shifted fully to Milo. And that was the moment everything accelerated, because proximity mattered, position mattered. And Milo had already demonstrated that it evaluated relationships between entities, not just entities themselves. The distance between Lynn and the intruder shrinking below a threshold that had not been formally defined, but was clearly real. Don't, Cade said sharply. But the warning came a fraction too late, the mercenary's foot crossing an invisible line in the space between Lynn and the containment chamber. And Milo reacted, the same way it had with the maintenance drone, but faster, more precise. A filament extending through the field without resistance, not toward the weapon, not toward the armor, but toward the space directly in front of Lynn, intercepting the vector between her and the approaching figure, and then stopping, hovering there, a barrier made of something that did not exist by normal definitions. Back up, Cade snapped, finger tightening on the trigger. Now. The mercenary hesitated, just for a moment, recalibrating, their helmet tilting as if processing new data. It's contained, they said, more to themselves than to anyone else, and that miscalculation, treating the field as a boundary rather than a suggestion, was the last one they made. Milo's filament shifted, not striking, not destroying, but interacting. The same impossible interaction Lynn had seen with the drone, except this time, it was directed at something far more complex. The mercenary's armor flickering as its systems registered an input they could not categorize. Shields collapsing inward, not breached, but nullified. And then the figure froze mid-step. Every motor function halted, weapon locked in place. The entire system reduced to inert hardware in the span of a single unmeasurable instant. What the hell? The second mercenary began, raising their weapon, and Cade fired before they could finish, the shot cracking through the lab with deafening force, kinetic rounds slamming into the armored chest and staggering the figure back. their shielding compensating, absorbing most of the impact, but not all. "Move!" Cade barked at Lynn, already shifting position, drawing fire away from her, because now it was a fight, not a standoff, and the rules had changed. Lynn moved on instinct, stepping back from the console, but her eyes never left Milo, because its behavior had diverged again, the single filament retracting as multiple new extensions formed, thinner, faster, each one aligning with a different vector in the room, not random, never random, always targeted, always precise. "Cade, stop," she said, the words cutting through the gunfire, because escalation here would not follow normal trajectories. "You're making it worse." "They're trying to take it," he shot back, firing again, forcing the remaining mercenaries into defensive positions, their armor adapting, shields flaring. "I know," Lynn replied, her voice louder now, urgent. "But it doesn't see that. It sees threats to me." The realization crystallizing even as she spoke it, the pattern from the drone, from Cade's positioning, from every interaction they had logged, all converging into a single, unavoidable conclusion. And as if to confirm it, Milo acted again, one filament snapping toward the third mercenary who had moved to flank, not attacking the body, but the weapon. The moment their targeting system locked onto Lynn, the weapon's internal circuitry ceased, power dropping to zero, the mercenary jerking back in confusion. "My rifle's dead," they started, and then froze entirely as a second filament intersected with their armor, the same clean, absolute interruption cascading through their systems. Within seconds, the room shifted from chaos to stillness. Two mercenaries frozen in place, their bodies locked in incomplete motion. The third retreating, weapon useless, backing toward the impossible doorway they had created. "This isn't containment," they said, voice stripped of its earlier confidence, something closer to fear threading through it now. "This is—" They did not finish, because Milo's attention snapped to them, all remaining filaments aligning in a single direction, a convergence that felt like a decision being made. And Lynn reacted before it could complete, stepping forward, closer to the field than she had ever been. "Milo," she said sharply, not soft, not calming, but firm, a command wrapped in familiarity, and the effect was immediate. The filaments halting mid-extension, the convergence breaking, the pattern dissolving back into something less focused, less final. The remaining mercenary did not wait for a second chance, turning and stepping back through the distorted opening, which collapsed behind them as if it had never been there, leaving only smooth, unbroken wall where a doorway had existed seconds before, the station alarms still blaring, the air thick with the residue of violence that had not fully happened. Cade held his position for several seconds longer, rifle trained on the empty space, waiting for a second wave that did not come. His breathing controlled, but heavier now, the aftershock of adrenaline settling in. "You okay?" he asked, without turning, because he did not need to look to know where Lynn was, the center of everything that had just happened. "I'm fine," she said, though the word felt insufficient, her focus entirely on Milo, on the way its fluctuations were slowly returning to baseline, the filaments retracting one by one, leaving no trace, no damage, no evidence beyond the frozen figures still standing in the lab like broken statues. "They're alive," Cade said, lowering his rifle slightly, stepping closer to one of the immobilized mercenaries, scanning for signs of life. "Systems are just off." "Interrupted," Lynn corrected automatically, the term now firmly embedded in her understanding of Milo's capabilities. "Not destroyed." She stepped back to the console, pulling up readings, confirming what she already suspected, that every system in the affected suits had been set to a null state, not damaged, not corrupted, simply stopped. "It can choose the level of interaction," she added, more to herself than to Cade. "It didn't kill them. It could have," Cade replied, and the weight of that possibility settled over both of them. Heavy, undeniable, because restraint implied capacity, and capacity implied something far beyond what they had originally assumed. Lynn looked back at Milo, at the way it had stabilized once more, its orientation returning to her, the thin filament extending again, stopping just short of the field. The same precise distance as always. A constant in a system that had just demonstrated its ability to override every other variable in the room. And she understood then that the war Velk had warned about was not something approaching from the outside, not fleets and weapons and strategies, but something already here, already unfolding at a scale too small to see and too fundamental to stop. Because it did not fight in the ways they understood. It did not attack or defend in any conventional sense. It simply decided what could continue and what could not. And for now, it had decided that she would continue, and everything else would be measured against that choice. The station did not recover after the breach so much as settle into a new equilibrium. Alarms silenced manually by Cade when it became clear no second wave was coming. Corridor lights dimmed to conserve power under an override that no longer responded to standard reset commands, and the two immobilized mercenaries remained exactly where they had been stopped, their armor frozen mid-adjustment, diagnostic ports returning null across every subsystem except life support, which continued at a minimal, steady rate as if Milo had allowed only the processes necessary to prevent death. Nothing more. "They're not going anywhere," Cade said, circling one of them at a careful distance, rifle lowered but not slung, the barrel tracking in small, unconscious adjustments whenever Milo's readings shifted even slightly. "And neither are we," Lynn replied, not looking away from the console where she had layered every dataset she possessed, her logs, the station telemetry, Velk's fragmented transmission, into a composite model that refused to behave like any model she had ever built. Variables did not remain independent. Inputs did not produce consistent outputs, and yet there was structure there, buried beneath the contradictions, something that resembled a system if one stopped insisting that the system follow conventional rules. Milo had entered its longest stable phase since arrival. Fluctuations reduced to a low continuous baseline that pulsed in near-perfect sync with Lynn's own physiological readings, a correlation she had confirmed 3 separate ways and still did not fully trust, because the margin of error was too small, the alignment too precise. "It's not just reacting to you anymore," Cade said, stepping closer to the console, eyes flicking between the data and the containment chamber. "It's matching you." Lynn nodded once, slow, deliberate. "Synchronizing," she corrected, though the distinction felt thin. But that's not the whole picture. She expanded the display, isolating a second layer of data she had been hesitant to prioritize until now. Subtle distortions in the station's internal mapping grid, minute discrepancies in spatial coordinates that had previously been dismissed as sensor drift, but now formed a pattern when aligned with Milo's activity. "Look at this," she said, highlighting a series of points along the lab walls, the floor, the air itself. "These shifts only occur when Milo's activity spikes." Cade leaned in, frowning. "That's space," he said slowly. "It's bending space inside the room." "Not bending," Lynn said, her voice tightening as the realization solidified. "Re-referencing." She pulled up Velk's words. Overlaying them with the data, it eliminates the concept of distance between itself and its target. "It's not moving through space," she continued, echoing the conclusion from Part 1, now grounded in her own observations. "It's redefining what here means relative to itself." Cade let out a breath, that was almost a laugh, but not quite. So the containment field is only relevant because it allows it to be, Lynn finished. And the implication settled heavily between them. Because it meant every layer of security they had relied on was conditional, not absolute, dependent on Milo's current state rather than any inherent barrier. As if responding to the focus of their attention, Milo's fluctuations increased slightly, not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to shift the spatial distortion map in real time, the highlighted points moving, converging toward a region directly between Lynn and the containment field. "It's centering," she said, tracking the convergence. "On you," Cade added, and again, she did not correct him, because the model supported it, every variable pointing to the same conclusion, that Milo's internal framework used her as a reference coordinate, not metaphorically, but literally, anchoring its interactions with the environment to her position, her movement, her presence. Velk called it a stable reference point, Lynn said, pulling the phrase into the forefront of her analysis. If that's accurate, then... She hesitated, because the next step in the logic chain led somewhere she did not want to go without confirmation. "Then you're not just something it protects," Cade said, filling the gap with a bluntness that cut through her caution. "You're how it understands everything else." Lynn closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, not in denial, but in recalibration, because accepting that premise required reevaluating every interaction they had had since Milo's arrival. Every data point shifting meaning under the new framework. She stepped away from the console and moved closer to the containment field, slower than before, more deliberate, aware now that every movement she made could alter the system's internal geometry in ways she was only beginning to understand. "Milo," she said, voice steady, and the response was immediate, the filament extending, aligning with her position with that same exacting precision, stopping at the boundary, maintaining the distance. But now she could see more than before, not visually but conceptually, the way the space between them was being treated as a defined interval, a measurable constant within Milo's framework. "I need to test something," she said, more to herself than to Cade, though he heard the tension in her voice and stepped closer, alert. "What kind of test?" he asked, already anticipating the answer would involve risk. "Spatial displacement," Lynn replied, and before he could object, she took a single step to the left, a small movement, less than half a meter, and watched the data spike, the distortion map recalibrating instantly, the convergence point shifting to maintain alignment with her new position. Milo's filament adjusting in perfect sync, the distance between them preserved exactly, not approximately, not with delay, but with immediate correction. "It's recalculating space around me," she said, the words precise, clinical, even as the implications pressed harder against her composure. "Not following me, redefining the relationship between us and everything else." Cade ran a hand over his face, a gesture of frustration more than fatigue. "So, if you move, the world moves with you, within a limited scope," Lynn corrected, though the limit was not yet defined. "But yes." She took another step, this time forward, closer to the field, reducing the gap, and the system responded again, the distortion intensifying, the convergence tightening, Milo's fluctuations rising in a controlled, focused pattern that mirrored the increased proximity. "And if I cross the boundary?" "Don't." Cade cut in immediately, sharper than before, stepping in to block her path, his body placing itself between her and the containment field without conscious thought. And the reaction was instant. Milo's reading spiking, not as violently as during the mercenary incident, but enough to register as a clear escalation, the filament extending further, pressing closer to the field, the spatial distortion map flaring at the edges. "Cade, move," Lynn said quickly, not raising her voice but infusing it with urgency, because she could see the pattern forming again, the same alignment that had preceded the neutralization of the drone, the mercenaries. "You're in the vector." "I'm not letting you step into that thing," he shot back. But he did not move immediately, and that hesitation was enough to push the system toward a threshold Lynn did not want to cross. "Please," she said, the word slipping out before she could filter it. And that, more than the logic, more than the data, broke through Cade's resistance. Because he had never heard her say that. Not like that. Not in this context. He stepped back a half-meter, just enough to clear the direct line between Lynn and the field, and Milo's readings dropped instantly. The escalation collapsing as quickly as it had formed, the filament retracting slightly, the distortion map stabilizing. "Okay," Cade said, quieter now, the realization settling in with a weight that matched hers. "It doesn't like anything between you and it." "Not anything," Lynn corrected, her mind already refining the model. "Anything it categorizes as interference." She took a breath, steadying herself, then made the next move, the one she had been building toward since the test began. She raised her hand and extended it toward the field, stopping just short of contact, the same position she had used dozens of times before, but this time she did not hold there. She continued, slow, deliberately, crossing the boundary. The containment field registered the intrusion immediately, alarms triggering in sharp, escalating tones, energy levels spiking as the system attempted to compensate. But the expected resistance never came. No barrier, no force pushing back. Her hand passed through as if the field were a projection rather than a physical constraint. And for a fraction of a second, nothing happened, the world holding its breath around that point of contact. And then Milo responded, not with aggression, but with alignment, its entire form shifting toward her hand, the filament extending to meet it, stopping at a distance so small it was almost contact. And the spatial distortion map collapsed inward, converging completely on that point, every variable in the system recalibrating around the new configuration. Lynn felt it then, not physically, not as a touch, but as a change in the way the space around her behaved. A subtle but undeniable shift, like standing at the center of a coordinate system that had just been redrawn. "Lynn," Cade's voice cut through, tight with controlled alarm. But he did not move forward this time, did not break the alignment, because he could see what was happening in the data, could see that this was not an attack, not a breach, but something else entirely. Milo's fluctuations slowed, then matched her own again, the filament holding steady in that near-contact position, the system stabilizing around the new state as if it had always been meant to be this way. "It's not just referencing me," Lynn said, her voice barely above a whisper now, the words forming as the realization crystallized. "It's anchoring to me." She swallowed, the weight of it settling fully for the first time. "I'm not outside the system," she added, eyes fixed on the space where her hand hovered inches from something that should not exist. "I'm the center of it." Cade did not respond immediately, because there was nothing to say that would reduce the impact of that statement. Nothing that would make it smaller, safer, more manageable. So he did the only thing he could. He stayed where he was, watching, waiting, because whatever this had become, whatever Milo was becoming, it was no longer contained within the lab or the station or even the definitions they had started with. It was a structure forming in real time, and at its center stood a single human being who had reached out, and something that should have erased her had chosen instead to align with her completely. The realization did not arrive as a single revelation, but as a cascade of small confirmations that refused to be ignored, each one tightening the pattern Lynn had begun to see until it could no longer be dismissed as incomplete data. because every new input aligned with it instead of breaking it. And that was what made it dangerous. Not the unknown, but the consistency. She did not pull her hand back immediately after crossing the containment field, not because she trusted the situation, but because withdrawing now would erase the most valuable dataset she had ever had access to. Her fingers hovering within that near contact distance from Milo's filament. Every sensor in the room pushing beyond calibrated limits as they attempted to record an interaction that did not register in any conventional spectrum. "You need to step back," Cade said, voice controlled but tight, his stance rigid at the edge of the new invisible boundary that had formed around Lynn. A line he did not cross this time, not because he lacked the instinct to protect, but because he had learned what crossing that line did to the system. "Not yet," Lynn replied, her focus absolute, her breathing measured in deliberate intervals as she tracked the data in real time, because what she was seeing now was not just reaction or synchronization, but structure. Layers of behavior stacking in ways that suggested purpose, and purpose implied direction. Milo's fluctuations had entered a state she had not observed before. Not low, not high, but coherent. Each micro-variation aligning with a corresponding shift in the spatial distortion map. The entire system behaving like a unified construct rather than a collection of responses. "It's stabilizing at a higher order," she said, almost to herself, logging the metrics even as they redefined themselves. "Not just matching me, using me." "That's not better," Cade replied, the bluntness of the statement grounding the moment in something human, something simple. "No," Lynn agreed quietly, because it wasn't. It was something else entirely. The station's external sensors came back online in fragmented bursts, not because the system had recovered, but because something was allowing it to function again. Selective restoration rather than repair, and the first image that resolved on the main display was enough to pull both of their attention away from the containment chamber for a fraction of a second. Long enough to register scale, because the space around E17 was no longer empty, shapes moving at the edge of visibility. Not ships, not debris, but distortions similar to the ones Velk had recorded, only larger, more numerous, each one a localized collapse of distance that resolved into presence when observed directly. "That's not possible," Cade said, though the phrase had long since lost its meaning in this context. "They're here," Lynn said instead, because the data confirmed it. Multiple entities occupying positions that could not be defined by coordinates alone. "Fragments," she added, the word fitting too well now, too precisely. "They followed the signal," Cade said, thinking tactically even as the situation moved beyond tactics. "Or they followed it." He nodded toward Milo, toward Lynn, toward the alignment that had formed, and Lynn felt that cold, precise understanding settle deeper, because Velk's transmission had warned of this. Not directly, but in implication. Stable reference points did not just anchor a fragment, they created a beacon, a coordinate that could be resolved by others of its kind. Milo reacted before the station could fully process the external threat, its fluctuations spiking not into chaos, but into a pattern that mirrored the distortions outside, resonance rather than opposition. The spatial map inside the lab expanding, stretching beyond its previous limits, linking to points that were no longer confined to the room. "It's connecting," Lynn said, her voice tightening as the data extended past the boundaries she had been working within. "Not just here, out there." "Connecting to what?" Cade asked, though the answer was already visible on the display. Shapes coalescing into forms that did not have edges, did not have consistent dimensions, but had presence. Undeniable and immediate. The first external interaction occurred at the station's hull, not as an impact, but as a correction, a section of reinforced plating along docking ring 3 simply ceasing to exist as a barrier. The internal and external volumes merging for a fraction of a second before stabilizing into a new configuration that included both spaces as one continuous environment. Alarms flaring and then cutting out as the system failed to categorize the event. "Hull breach. No, that's not a breach," Cade said, the words coming out in fragments as he tried to reconcile training with reality. "It's rewriting the station," Lynn finished, because that was what the data showed. Structural integrity not compromised, but redefined. One of the external entities resolved just enough to be perceived within that merged space, a larger version of Milo in the loosest possible sense, its fluctuations more complex, its distortions deeper. And for a single precise moment, it aligned with the pattern inside the lab, with Milo, with Lynn, a three-point system forming across scales. "They're synchronizing," Lynn said, the conclusion unavoidable now. "Through me," Cade added, and there was no argument left to make against that, no alternate model that fit the data. The implications unfolded rapidly, each one more unsettling than the last, because if multiple fragments could align through a single reference point, then the behavior Velk had described, the eradication of entire civilizations, was not random, not predatory in the way the galaxy understood predators, but systematic, a process of elimination based on a defined center, a set of conditions that determined what remained and what did not. Milo's filament moved again, not toward Lynn this time, but outward, extending past the containment field, past the space of the lab, into the newly merged volume where the larger entity hovered. And for the first time, Lynn saw direct interaction between them, not as a collision, but as an exchange. Patterns flowing between the two in a way that bypassed any measurable medium. Data without carrier, information without transmission. And the effect on Milo was immediate, its fluctuations increasing in complexity, new behaviors emerging in real time. "It's learning from them," she said, the words carrying a weight that pressed against her chest, because the direction of that learning was no longer constrained by her inputs alone. "Or they're learning from it," Cade countered, watching the external display where additional distortions were resolving, more fragments converging on the station's position. "From you," he corrected. And that was the point where the pattern snapped fully into place for Lynn, not as a hypothesis, but as a structure she could map, because she had enough data now, enough alignment across scales to see the function beneath the behavior. "They don't have a society," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the realization. "No hierarchy, no communication network, no shared framework until this," she gestured, not just to Milo, but to the entire system that had formed around her. "The reference point creates it." "Creates what?" Cade asked, though he was already bracing for the answer. "A center," Lynn said, the word precise, chosen carefully. "A point of alignment that defines relationships, priorities, interactions, everything." She swallowed. The next part harder to say because it reframed the entire narrative of what these entities were. Without it, they're just processes, isolated, reactive. She looked at Milo, at the way it had stabilized in this new configuration, at the way the external entities were now aligning with it through her. With it, they become something else. "A system," Cade said, echoing Velk's earlier conclusion but with a different weight now, a different scale. "More than that," Lynn replied quietly. "A perspective." And that was the part that made her hands tremble just slightly, because perspective implied selection, choice, criteria. As if in response to that thought, one of the external entities shifted, its distortion focusing on a point beyond the station, a distant object that resolved on the sensors as a small coalition patrol craft, likely drawn by the same signals that had brought the mercenaries, its trajectory adjusting as it attempted to approach, unaware of what it was entering. "They see it," Cade said, tension snapping back into his voice. "Lynn, they see it." Milo's fluctuations spiked again, not in response to the ship itself, but to Lynn's reaction to it, the system amplifying her awareness, her concern, mapping it onto the external environment, and the alignment shifted, the three-point system reorienting, targeting not in the human sense, but in a way that achieved the same result. Because the patrol craft's coordinates began to destabilize, its position flickering between points as if the space it occupied was being questioned. "Stop," Lynn said immediately, the words sharp, directed not at Cade but at Milo, at the system, at the entire framework that had formed. And for a fraction of a second, nothing changed, because the system was not responding to commands. It was responding to her state, her priorities, her implicit definitions of threat and safety. She forced herself to recalibrate, to remove the fear from the equation, to redefine the situation in her own mind as neutral, as non-threatening, because that was the only way to test the hypothesis. "It's not a threat," she said, slower now, controlled, projecting the intent through her voice, her posture, every measurable output she could influence. And the effect rippled outward. Milo's fluctuations adjusting, the external entities following suit, the patrol craft's coordinates stabilizing as the system's focus shifted away from it. "It worked," Cade said, a mix of relief and disbelief threading through his tone. "You just changed the criteria," Lynn finished, because that was what it was. Not a command, but a redefinition of what the system considered relevant. And that realization was the darkest one yet, because it meant the destruction Velk had witnessed, the eradication of entire worlds, might not have been driven by malice or hunger or any recognizable form of hostility, but by alignment with a reference point that had defined those civilizations as incompatible. She lowered her hand slowly, pulling it back from the near contact position, and this time Milo did not follow, did not extend to maintain the exact distance, instead holding its position as if the system no longer required that precise physical alignment to maintain the connection, a sign that the framework had expanded beyond the initial constraints. "It's scaling," she said, the words quiet, almost lost in the hum of the station. "The connection doesn't need proximity anymore." Cade stared at the display, at the shapes outside, at the way they held position relative to the station, to Lynn, to Milo. "So what happens when it doesn't need you at all?" he asked. And that question hung in the air, heavier than any alarm, any weapon, any immediate threat. Because Lynn did not have an answer, not yet. But she had a direction, a trajectory defined by the data, and it led somewhere she could not avoid. Because the system they had created, she had created, was no longer local, no longer contained. It was expanding, learning, aligning, and at its center was a single human perspective that would determine, intentionally or not, what the galaxy would become in its presence. The station no longer felt like a structure anchored to a moon, but like a coordinate suspended inside something larger, a reference point defined not by mass or orbit, but by alignment. And Lynn stood at its center with a clarity that cut through fear, not because the situation was safe, but because it was finally, completely understandable. The external distortions held position in a loose perimeter around E-17, not encroaching, not retreating, their presence stabilized by the framework that had formed through her, through Milo, through the connection that had expanded beyond proximity into something that resembled a network without edges, without latency, without any of the limitations that defined conventional interaction. "They're waiting," Cade said quietly, his rifle lowered now, not because he trusted the situation, but because he had run out of ways to meaningfully threaten it, his eyes tracking the sensor display where each entity registered not as a fixed point, but as a probability cloud anchored to a relationship rather than a coordinate. "Not waiting," Lynn corrected, her voice calm, stripped down to function. "They're aligned." She watched the data streams stabilize into patterns that repeated across scales, micro-fluctuations inside the containment chamber mirroring macro distortions outside the station, a recursive structure that reinforced itself with every cycle. "They don't act unless the framework requires it." "And the framework is you," Cade said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact, one that had settled into him over the last hours with a weight that no longer shocked him, only grounded him in what needed to be done next. Lynn did not answer immediately, because the next step was not about acknowledging that truth, but about understanding its limits, if it had any. She moved back to the console, pulling in every external feed the station could still access, stitching together a broader picture of the system's reach, and what she saw confirmed the trajectory she had feared and expected at the same time. The distortions were not confined to the immediate vicinity. They extended outward in faint, intermittent traces, like echoes of the alignment propagating through space, linking to other points, other potential fragments. "It's spreading," she said, the words precise, measured. Not physically, structurally. Cade exhaled slowly, processing that in the only way he could, by reducing it to consequence. "So this doesn't stop here?" "No," Lynn said, and there was no hesitation in it, because the data did not allow for it. "It doesn't." She turned from the console and faced the containment chamber, though the term had lost its meaning now, the field still active but irrelevant, a relic of an earlier understanding. Milo held its position within, its form stable in a way that was almost serene, fluctuations low, coherent, perfectly synchronized with her own baseline, no longer needing the constant input of her voice or proximity to maintain the connection. "Milo," she said, and the response was immediate, not in movement, but in alignment, the entire system acknowledging the reference point, the network tightening imperceptibly around her presence. The realization that followed was not new, but it settled differently now, with finality rather than discovery, because she had enough evidence to stop questioning it, enough confirmation to accept what it meant without searching for alternative explanations. "They're not protecting me," she said quietly, more to herself than to Cade, though he heard it clearly. "They're preserving the center." Cade shifted his weight, the words landing in a place that had been forming in him since the first mercenary had frozen mid-step. "Which means anything that threatens you is removed," Lynn finished, and the simplicity of it was what made it terrifying. Not a decision made in anger or fear, not a calculation weighed against alternatives, just a condition evaluated and resolved. As if drawn by the thought, the station's long-range sensors picked up a new signal, a cluster of coalition vessels dropping out of transit at the edge of detection range, larger than the patrol craft from before, a coordinated formation this time. "They're back," Cade said, tension returning to his voice despite everything he had just accepted. Because training did not vanish, it adapted, and this was still a threat in the way he understood threats. "They won't understand what this is," he added, glancing at Lynn, at the containment chamber, at the shapes outside. "They'll see a target." Lynn followed his gaze to the display, watching the incoming ships resolve into clearer forms, their trajectories adjusting as they locked onto the station. Weapons systems cycling to active status in a pattern she recognized from countless simulations. Yes, she said, because that part of the universe had not changed, not yet. They will. Milo's fluctuations increased slightly, not in response to the ships themselves, but to Lynn's awareness of them, the system amplifying her perception, mapping it outward, and the external distortions responded in kind, their positions shifting subtly, not moving closer but reorienting, aligning with a new vector that intersected with the incoming formation. Lynn, Cade said more urgently now, you need to decide what this is going to do. And that was the moment everything converged, not in the data, not in the system, but in her. Because the framework did not contain intent on its own, it reflected it, amplified it, executed it without interpretation. And that meant the next action would not be chosen by Milo, or by the fragments, or by any external force. It would be chosen by her, whether she acted consciously or not. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, not to retreat, but to isolate, to strip away the noise, the fear, the instinctive reactions that would bias the outcome. And she focused on the simplest possible definition she could construct, one that did not rely on threat or alliance or any of the categories that had defined conflict until now. They're not a threat, she said finally, the words deliberate, each one placed with care, not because she believed it in the human sense, but because she needed the system to register it as truth. They're just outside the framework. She opened her eyes and looked at Milo, at the alignment that connected them, at the network that extended beyond the station. And that's okay. The effect was immediate and profound. Milo's fluctuations shifted, not increasing or decreasing, but changing pattern, the coherence adjusting to incorporate the new parameter, and the external distortions responded in sequence, the alignment reconfiguring, the vector that had been forming toward the incoming ships dissolving, replaced by a broader, more diffuse structure that no longer targeted them specifically. On the display, the coalition vessels continued their approach, unaware of the recalibration that had just occurred, their weapons systems still active, their trajectories unchanged. They're still coming, Cade said, a note of confusion threading through his voice, because he expected a visible response, an immediate consequence. Yes, Lynn said, watching the data rather than the ships, because they don't know they're not a threat yet. And that was the final piece, the one that connected everything Velk had seen, everything she had observed, into a single coherent model. The system did not distinguish between friend and enemy, between ally and adversary. It distinguished between compatible and incompatible, between what aligned with the reference point and what did not. She took a step forward, closing the last fraction of distance to the containment field, her hand rising again, not hesitating this time as it passed through the boundary, into the space where Milo's filament extended to meet it, the near contact position reestablished, the anchor reinforced. And she spoke again, not to Milo alone, but to the entire system that had formed around her. They're part of this too, she said, the words carrying more weight now, more reach. They just don't know it yet. The alignment shifted once more, broader this time, encompassing not just the station and the immediate distortions, but extending outward toward the incoming ships, not pulling them in, not forcing connection, but redefining the relationship between them and the center. The first visible effect occurred not as an attack, but as a failure to engage, the lead coalition vessel's targeting systems flickering, locking and unlocking in rapid succession as their sensors attempted to resolve a target that no longer fit their parameters. What are they doing? Cade said, watching the erratic behavior. They can't define it, Lynn replied, because that was what the data showed. The ship's systems were built on assumptions about space, about objects, about threats. And those assumptions were being undermined at a fundamental level. The framework they relied on no longer aligning with reality as it had been redefined. One by one, the ship's weapons powered down, not by command, but by failure to maintain a valid lock, their formation loosening as navigation systems recalibrated against a shifting coordinate system, confusion spreading through their network in a way that did not require interception to be understood. "They're standing down," Cade said, disbelief edging into his voice. "No," Lynn corrected softly, watching the broader pattern rather than the immediate action. "They're being included." And that was the word that fit. Not conquered, not neutralized, but brought into alignment with a system that did not require their understanding to function. Behind her, the two immobilized mercenaries remained frozen, outside the framework she had just extended, their state unchanged. A reminder that inclusion was not automatic, not retroactive. It required a condition to be met, a definition to be accepted, and anything outside that definition simply stopped. Lynn lowered her hand slowly, the connection holding even as the physical proximity decreased, the anchor now established at a level that did not require continuous reinforcement, and she felt the system settle around her, not pressing, not constraining, but present, a constant that would not fade when she stepped away from the console or left the room or even the station, because distance no longer applied in the way it once had. "So that's it," Cade said after a long moment, his voice quieter now. The immediate crisis passed, but the larger reality settling in.
"We just let this spread."
Lynn looked at him, really looked at him, seeing not just the soldier, but the person who had stayed, who had adapted, who had chosen to remain within a system that no longer made sense by any standard he had been trained for. "We don't let it do anything," she said gently. "It's already happening." She turned back to the display, to the ships stabilizing in their new trajectories, to the distortions holding their positions, to Milo, still aligned with her at the center of it all. "The only question is what it becomes." Cade followed her gaze, the weight of that settling in alongside everything else. "And that depends on you," he said, not as pressure, but as acknowledgement. And Lynn did not deny it, because denial would not change the structure that had formed, would not remove her from the center of it, would not stop the propagation that was already extending beyond anything they could see. She took a slow breath, steadying herself not against fear, but against the enormity of the choice embedded in every thought she would have from this point forward. Because intent was no longer private, no longer contained within her own mind. It was a parameter, a variable that shaped a system capable of rewriting reality around it. And she understood then why Velk's warning had been framed the way it was, why entire civilizations had been erased without resistance, without even understanding what was happening to them, because they had never realized they were being evaluated against something they could not perceive. Milo's filament extended one last time, stopping at that precise, familiar distance from her hand, a constant that had defined the beginning of everything that followed. And Lynn met it without hesitation, holding the space between them with a steadiness that came not from certainty, but from acceptance. And in that alignment, the system stabilized, the network holding its form, the distortions outside settling into a quiet, watchful presence that no longer pressed inward or reached outward, simply existing in relation to the center. The galaxy would not understand this. Not yet. Perhaps not for a very long time. It would see the aftermath, the sudden failures of weapons, the collapse of conflicts that no longer aligned with whatever criteria this system applied, the quiet disappearance of anything that crossed a boundary no one could define. And it would search for explanations in the language it knew. In war, in technology, in strategy. And it would be wrong. Because the truth was simpler and far more unsettling than any of those frameworks allowed. The monsters had not become less dangerous. They had not been tamed or controlled or reduced to tools. They had learned something far more complex, far more unpredictable. They had learned how to care. And in doing so, they had learned how to choose. And that choice, anchored to a single human perspective at the center of an ever-expanding system, would determine not who they destroyed, but who they allowed to remain.